I've got a few tips to share in this video about painting on Aquabord. I've painted on it about 5 or 6 times now, so I'm no expert on this surface, but I can share with you what I have learned so far. I painted a portrait of my little grandson on it. Maybe not a good subject choice for me because I'm still learning to paint portraits, but I wanted to challenge myself. If you want to learn to paint in watercolour, head to my website to find out more about my online watercolour classes. We have a fabulous and supportive community of artists and we're all learning and growing together. I've put a link about the classes in the description of this video. Ampersand Aquabord is a unique surface for artists who work with water-based media like watercolour and gouache. It's made from warp-resistant hardboard, so it doesn't need to be stretched before you paint on it. It will stay flat no matter how wet you work. The board is protected with an archiver seal and then it's coated with an acid-free clay and mineral ground. So it's not going to yellow over time and it's absorbent. Its texture is like cold press or rough watercolour paper. Although it has a similar texture to watercolour paper, it doesn't behave like watercolour paper. If you are used to painting with watercolour on paper, you will have to alter the way that you paint if you use this. It's a totally different experience. All right, let's have a look at how my painting went. Ampersand recommend wetting the surface of the Aquabord to release trapped air bubbles before you start your painting. So I used a large flat brush to wet it with some clean water before I started. When it was dry, I transferred my drawing onto the board and then I started to lightly paint in the shadow areas on his face just to give me a starting point. I use inexpensive synthetic watercolour brushes whenever I paint on this surface because it's highly textured and I don't want to wear down my more expensive brushes. Here I'm painting a second layer and I'm using a number 12 brush. I painted this while the surface was dry, but I'm wondering now if I should have dampened it first. Normally, when I'm painting on paper, I try to use large brushes to reduce the amount of brush strokes. But with this surface, I find myself reaching for the smaller brushes. They hold less water and paint, and I feel a bit more in control when I use them. It's really easy to lift paint on this surface, which I'll show you later. So I find it's better to work in small areas and have more control. When you paint on Aquabord, just like when you work on paper, it's best to work light to dark. But you have to alter the way you paint. Normally, I would wet the paper and paint loose washes in these early stages. I use big brushes and the paint flows effortlessly over the paper. It creeps and bleeds and creates beautiful effects all by itself. Painting on this surface is completely different. The paint doesn't bleed or creep. The surface dries really quickly, but even though it dries quickly, you do have more time to move the paint around with your brush than you do on paper, because the paint doesn't soak in like it does on paper. It sits on the surface, so you can constantly push, move it, or remove it if you need to. It's not permanent like it is when you work on paper. Here I was trying to paint in the subtle differences in skin tone and start to form the shape of the face. I was putting the paint on, pushing it, wiping it off, softening edges, reapplying it. It looked like a patchy mess at this stage and I had to push through and keep going to get past this messy stage. What I found with this painting was that the more layers I painted on, the better it started to look, which is different to painting on paper. The more you fuss and layer on paper, the more you begin to overwork your watercolour painting. If you are layering and struggling on paper, it shows on the finished painting. When you paint a heap of layers on watercolour paper, the paint might start to lose its luminosity and the painting starts to look heavy and laboured. And that's not the case when you paint on Aquabord. As I mentioned, the more layers I painted, the smoother the skin started to look. The colours remain luminous because they aren't penetrating into the surface. With the mouth, I painted in the basic shapes first, then later on I came back to it and I layered some more paint on top, and I was also able to soften and actually lose some of the hard edges long after they had dried. And that's a really helpful benefit of painting on Aquabord. As I said, the risk of overworking your painting isn't there when you paint on Aquabord. I fussed with the eyes for ages. I put paint on, I took paint off, I moved the paint around, I pulled out highlights. I kept working on them until I was satisfied. You can paint to your heart's content. If you go too dark, you lift the colour back off easily. If you paint the wrong colour on, you take it off and you start again. You have so much freedom to do that on Aquabord. It takes the pressure off. You can experiment and try different things. I took a break from painting the face and I painted in the hat. I used a larger brush to do this so that I could get the paint on there quickly. I had thought that I'd need to layer the colour on the hat quite a bit, but once that first layer went on, I quite liked the way that it looked. So I ended up just leaving it with that one layer of paint, and all I did was paint a few more layers into the shadow areas. And because I had been painting so tightly, I wanted to loosen up slightly and try to make it look a bit more painterly. I love working on wet paper, so I wanted to see if I could use one of the techniques I use when I paint on paper. I wet the top of the board with water and painted on some of the hat colour, which was French ultramarine. Then I tilted the board and let it flow up to the top. I left that to dry and then I started to work on this darkest area of the hat. So for there I used a bit of Payne's Grey and I painted on wet Aquabord, so I dampened it with water first. And as I said, the surface dries really quickly when you wet it, but it doesn't really hamper the painting process because you're painting differently to when you're painting on watercolour paper. You can soften those hard edges that you don't want long after they have dried. It takes a lot of patience to paint on this surface, but it is very forgiving, which is unlike watercolour paper. Again, I used my little tiny brushes when I was painting in the ear, just layering the paint. Painted in the basic shapes first, and then I started to look at the different variations in tone. And if I got the colour wrong, I just replaced it with another colour. So here the board is dry. I put the paint on and then I get my brush and soften paint edges. I was experimenting. The top of the ear I wet with water and then I put the paint on, just trying different things as I painted him. This is where I can show you how easy it is to lift paint from Aquabord. This is a Rosemary & Co. Eradicator brush. I've linked to it in the description of the video. I use the brush wet on the dry board, and you can see how easily I can go right back virtually to the white surface of the board to create those highlights on the hat. Being able to lift paint that easily can be a benefit, but it can also be a hindrance. You might disturb areas that you don't want to disturb. So you need to make sure each layer is completely dry before you start your next layer. I use a hairdryer to dry everything between layers. Also, be aware of the moisture level in your brush. You need to be able to control that. You don't need a really wet brush when you paint on Aquabord generally. Make sure you have an old towel or some paper towel nearby that you can continually dab your brush on before you put it to the surface. Another benefit of using Aquabord is that you can scratch into it easily to create some highlights. Here I'm using a craft knife to create some fine hair over the dark area of the hat there. With the shirt, I only painted 2 layers. So I painted that initial layer first, let it dry, and now I'm starting to paint in the little shadow that's cast there by his head. I quite liked the patchiness of it. I had spent so much time working on the face, and the face has got so many different layers on it, that I quite liked the looseness of the hat and the t-shirt. I didn't really want to fuss too much with these areas. After I had finished the shirt, I went back to his eyes and I made a few adjustments there until I was happy with them. And there it is finished. Another one of the benefits of painting on Aquabord is that you don't have to frame the finished painting behind glass. You can seal it with some archival spray varnish to protect it. This will need a frame around it, but you can buy cradled Aquabords that don't need a frame. I might do a bit more work on this before I spray it with some varnish. So there are a lot of benefits to painting on Aquabord, but as I've said, it's totally different to painting on watercolour paper. It takes a lot of getting used to. It's not easy to use, but it's a forgiving surface and you can experiment on it. Thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful to you. I'll see you next week. I've got a few ships. Lucky I didn't say the other word. I've got a few ships to tear with you in this video. And then it's coated with an acid-free clay and... So there are...
Just this.
Oh God! What is wrong with it? There's nothing wrong with it. Okay, let's start again.